there shall be a body to be called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice. 2, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice may make representations to the Parliament and the executive government of the Commonwealth on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. 3, the Parliament shall, subject to this Constitution, have power to make laws with respect to matters relating to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice, including its composition, functions, powers, and procedures. So it's quite broad in its wording, and it's difficult to really get a grasp on what that means. It says there's going to be a voice. It says it's about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. It's their voice. And it says that that voice can make representations to the Parliament. Now, I read a paper from Justice French recently, who's an ex-High Court judge, and he said, although this will be inserted into the Constitution if the referendum is successful, there's no obligation whatsoever for the Commonwealth Government to actually listen and implement the requests of the voice. And it's quite interesting because it's basically a law that's being inserted into the Constitution so as to write laws for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. But it's interesting because those laws already actually exist. And in the Constitution, there's 51 lawmaking powers, as we've spoken about many times on this platform. And there's 51, section 51(26) of the Constitution. And that actual lawmaking power of the government is that I'll read from the start, is the Parliament shall, subject to the Constitution, have power to make laws for the peace, order and good government of the Commonwealth with respect to, and the actual provision is, the people of any race for whom it is deemed necessary to make special laws. So the power actually already exists in the Constitution. Prior to 1967, it actually said that the Aboriginals were not included in that particular provision or that lawmaking power. And there was a referendum in 1967 to actually remove the Aboriginal or the estoppel for making laws for Aboriginals from that. So basically, the 1967 referendum pulled out the discrimination against Aboriginals, and it allowed the government to write laws for everybody and not just everybody except for the Aboriginals. So some people look at that as being a good thing for Aboriginals. Some people look at it as being a bad thing for Aboriginals, because clearly when the British came here, the Aboriginals were not to be counted in the Constitution. We had a section 127 of the Constitution which provided for that, and that was actually also it was repealed out of the Constitution back in 1967. And the second part of it was what we just discussed, the removal of the Aboriginals from 51(26). So it allowed the Commonwealth to write laws. Now, I suppose what we really need to speak about is the fact that when the British came here, there never was a treaty, like, for example, there was in New Zealand. And I'll use the word ownership of land, which is actually a British or a Western concept. that was never discussed, and there was never an agreement brought about by the British with the Aboriginals. And so that's been, I suppose, the argument of the Australian government and the Aboriginal people of, do they actually still have rights to their land? If you go and speak to most Aboriginal people, they will say that they do not own the land, and that they actually hold the land so as to pass it on to the next generation, and they're basically a custodian of the land. This concept of ownership never really came to Australia until the British landed here. So it's quite interesting that all of a sudden there's this group of Aboriginals that are claiming ownership, so to speak. And what is ownership? You know, we're all told that, you know, the great Australian dream is to own your own home and you own your own land. But when you actually break it down and look at that legally, you don't actually own your land, and you're just the registered keeper. You have some basic rights, some exclusive rights to the land, which is the quiet enjoyment of the land and being able to will the land onto the person of your choice. So this concept that we're sold of land ownership isn't actually ownership. And once again, it looks back to, I suppose, that, you know, the Aboriginal concept, which is, you know, holding the land for future generations and passing that land on. This concept where people now allegedly have to pay the rent, for example, that's been going on for a long time, where there has been hundreds of millions of dollars that have been generated and have been spent by Aboriginal committees. And but the issues with that is that most of the Aboriginals, you know, down on the ground, don't actually benefit from those particular funds that are generated by the government and allegedly for the Aboriginal people. And this is the issue. If you've got all of this money being put aside and it's being put towards all of these Aboriginal causes, and we hear from the Aboriginals down on the ground saying, well, I'm not receiving any sort of benefit. And I was in the Northern Territory back in 2020, and we saw this, we witnessed this, Aboriginals living in squalor and not receiving benefits, and the government giving them a token community centre here or there, so that there's this projection that there's something being done for the Aboriginal people, where there's nothing actually being done for the people themselves. There's just these companies that basically take large sums of money to basically provide community centres, and then there's certain things that are put in place. You know, we're gonna try and take Aboriginals off alcohol and things like that. And these things fall short of helping the Aboriginals, you know, where they actually require that help. I'd like to play a video that's come to my attention, because as Rod mentioned earlier, there's an alleged architect of the Voice referendum, and his name is Thomas Mayo. And I was sent this video recently, and I think it's important that everyone has a look at it just to understand the background of Thomas Mayo and what's actually behind the Voice. So I'll share that to the screen and we'll have a look at it right now.
The people who stand with me on this stage, I regard as giants.
Thomas Mayo.
Thomas Mayo.
Written a handbook called the Voice to Parliament Handbook. All the details you need.
Thomas Mayo is a signatory to the Uluru Statement from the Heart, but was also entrusted with the physical document.
Mayo is part of the Referendum Working Group.
He spent 18 months travelling around Australia to garner support for an Indigenous voice to Parliament.
And I tell you what,
We are sick of governments not listening to our voice. We are going to use the rule book of the nation to force them.
There is nothing more powerful than building a First Nations voice, a black institution, a black political force to be reckoned with.
Keep going until we change the system, until we tear down the institutions that harm our people.
And also to pay respects to the elders of the Communist Party, who I think, without a doubt, have played a very important role in our activism. You know, this is the first step. It's a vital step. Pay the rent, for example. You know, how do we do that in a way that is transparent and that it actually sees reparations and compensation to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? The power in the voice is that it creates the ability for First Nations to go forth with coherent positions on what legislation needs to be created, what legislation needs to be amended, and punish politicians that ignore our advice.
This is a modest request.
Authorised by Matthew Sheehan, Advance Australia, Canberra.
Now, we're not trying to advocate for Advance Australia or anything like that. There's some interesting information in that video. One is the communist aspect of what's actually going on behind the scenes.
Great.
And if you follow these points in that video, you'll find that people like Anthony Albanese have been supporters of this particular communist regime. They're since before the 1967 referendum and allegedly right back to the 20s, there's been this push in countries that have Indigenous populations so as to overthrow the governments and install communist regimes. There's a couple of books that are available. One's called Red Over Black, and it's by a gentleman named Jeff McDonald, and it's called Behind the Aboriginal Land Rights. And then there's a second book that he wrote called The Evidence, and this is the evidence of the position that he writes about in Red Over Black. It's an interesting read, and basically this has been going on for a long time, where they've been using this agenda so as to basically tear down the constitution of our nation and to install a separate government